because you can't arrest yourself out of this problem. You got to have collaboration with the prosecutor, probation, child protective, and advocacy, and that's where the trust is built. All with a single focus of closing the gaps for the system when they get ready to leave, and are prepared for them when they do that. And miracle stuff happens there. I mean, it's just it's a wonderful thing, and it's to me it's a nod to police. We're going to stop looking at you and telling you you're responsible for all this, and they're not. The community's responsible. You got to have a community that's willing to say, I'll partner with the sheriff, I'll partner with the DA, I'll partner with the church. That's what it takes.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Lifeline, offering a holistic wellness approach focused on supporting American law enforcement, promoting resilience, safety, and survivability.
Welcome to Precinct 444. I'm Josh Bronson, Director of Education, Programs, and Visitor Experience here at the museum, and a former police officer with a deep commitment to addressing intimate partner violence. Today's episode, The Lethality of Domestic Violence, Perspectives from Law Enforcement, explores the deadly risk domestic violence poses, not only to victims, but also to the officers who respond to these calls. We're joined by two powerful voices today. Mark Wynn, an internationally recognized expert and former police lieutenant with decades of experience in domestic violence response and prevention, and Bruce Bieber, the father of Deputy Abigail Bieber, who tragically lost her life in a murder-suicide involving her boyfriend, also a law enforcement officer. Together, we'll examine how law enforcement's response to domestic violence has evolved, the dangers officers face, and what can be done to protect both victims and those who serve. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for being with us today. Let's begin. Mark, I want to start with you. Can you share a little bit about your background in law enforcement and what led you to focus so deeply on domestic violence?
Thank you, Josh, for inviting me to this podcast today. I'm a survivor. Let me just start there. Childhood survivor. For 10 years, living with an offender, stepfather. And then that sort of propelled me to get into law enforcement, even though, I came from a law enforcement family. I've got 6 generations now. My family are law enforcement officers, but spent my first year or two in Wichita, Kansas with the Sheriff's Department, and then moved back to Tennessee, where I'm originally from. And they hired me at the Nashville Metropolitan Police, and I worked there for the rest of my career. Worked in all the standard places: patrol officer, patrol sergeant, homicide detective. I was a SWAT officer for 15 years. Trained in our academy. Actually started training our recruits in '82 on domestic violence, and in our state academy here in Tennessee for over 30 years. And IACP. I was very lucky in the mid '80s to do some work for IACP. '87, '88. Started working for them as a subject matter expert, and still do today. Spent 15 years with ICP on their National Leadership Institute on Violence Against Women. 25, almost 30 years, I think now, with the State Department. I'm a Fulbright specialist for the U.S. State Department. So I train officers internationally on all forms of domestic violence, sex assault, stalking. And I've got my own consulting business now. So I do a lot of work for the Justice Department, Office of Violence Against Women, Office of Victims of Crime, National Sheriffs, Noble. I mean, I'll work for anybody. I'm like that guy on the side of the road. I'll work for food. I'll work for anybody. But it's been a good, it's been a good life experience for me because and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, the progression of where we are based on where we used to be, and that's been. Sorry about my clock going off there. So that's been. I'm encouraged, and we'll talk more about that. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And I have to say, too, it's been quite a journey of my own, first attending some training that you provided through IACP, through the supervisors leadership training that we did, and then being able to teach alongside you throughout my career as well, then has been a real honor. So I greatly appreciate your everything you've done in the field, and for me in particular, just learning from you has been fantastic. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Josh. And by the way, I didn't add that in '95 here in Nashville, we worked really hard on this. We were able to create the largest domestic violence investigative unit in U.S. history at the time. We had almost 40 personnel in the unit: captain, lieutenant, sergeants, 20 detectives, 6 master level crisis counselors. Because our murder rate was so high here in Nashville around domestic violence, and we'd lost 4 officers killed on domestics, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But I wanted to make sure that people understand I'm not talking out of the top of my head about this topic.
No, you're if there's a subject matter expert out there on domestic violence in the law enforcement world, it is you, Mark. So I definitely appreciate you being here. Bruce, let me turn to you. So I know, in addition to your daughter, Abigail, I know you have other children that are also in law enforcement. So you have a deep connection to the law enforcement field and care deeply about it. But would you be willing to share a little bit about yourself, your family, in particular, maybe Abigail's story, and what you want people to understand about her life and tragic death?
Oh, absolutely, Josh. And thank you, too, for the opportunity to talk about Abby and the whole officer-involved domestic violence, or police-perpetrated domestic violence, perhaps a more apt name, issue. It is important. It takes lives. It harms many others. And there are things that can be done and should be done about it. And I'm always happy to talk about it. And also, congratulations on the new position. I don't think we've spoken since you've assumed the helm over there. So good for you.
Appreciate that.
No, by all means. And I do come at it from a slightly different direction. While Mark so clearly has all the bona fides of, I don't know, Mark, I'm not slandering age or anything, but it's got to be over 40 years of law enforcement experience. For me, I was a commercial real estate and construction guy, nothing to do with law enforcement, until Abby's 2 older brothers went down the path, one after a combat tour with the U.S. Army, and the first one after considerable number of years in first responder on the fire side work as an EMT and a firefighter, then joining the blue team. They both still serve as police officers, one as a homicide detective and one as a canine officer. And Abigail, our youngest, third of 3, followed her 2 older brothers, between whom you couldn't slip a sheet of paper. They were that close. From birth till her death, and still to this day. I can't overemphasize how close a family we are, and those 3 kids were. Abby followed them. They were somewhat held, I think, as heroes by her, and she went into that honorable profession after getting a criminal justice degree at the University of Maryland. And she joined the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office down in the Tampa region, became a patrol deputy, met a guy on a call who was a detective, and we'll get to perhaps the circumstances of how that ended up, obviously, with her murder and his suicide. But her life, certainly when you're in my position, you have to do any and everything you can to make sure it means something, it stands for something. The tragedy, the aching gap, the chasm of despair, of grief, can't be described. And I've met in this sad journey many other dads and moms and some siblings who suffered it. And Mark, I know you know some of them, like Nikki and Jim Schmidt. And there's this very strange ability to communicate between parents who've lost a child that exists on a plane, other than that other folks who haven't been there communicate on. It's like a very different, there's no nonsense. You just get right down to business. You understand what matters. And you'll find patterns and similarities, if not almost identical positions that such parents reach, which is to say, I have to make sure this wasn't in vain, and I have to prevent it from happening to somebody else. I have to do all within my power to stop it. And it almost doesn't matter the circumstances of what caused that death. And this can happen with tragic accidents of all manner. It doesn't have to be OIDV, PPTV. It could be, a failure of a tire on a car. Somebody becomes an advocate for tire safety. But it so happens the way it played out for me and my family, it's OIDV, PPTV. So I'm here to save the next one. And sadly, since Abby was killed on January 29, 2022, way too many other women have not only died, and many, many more suffer in silence. So there's definitely work to be done.
Thank you for that, Bruce, and really appreciate you being here as well. I know the journey you've been on, and it's an important one, and I appreciate you being here and sharing your story, with us today. So, and to our listeners. So, thank you for that.
Yep.
So, diving into domestic violence itself, obviously, domestic violence can be extremely lethal. But it's often seen as just sort of a private issue, a matter between family members, a matter between spouses, partners, and not one that people should get involved in. Why is it critical for law enforcement and the public to understand the lethal potential? And Mark, I'll start with you.
Well, you have to look at the history here, Josh, and where we were years ago when I first started policing. And when my father policed, and my brother, my uncle, it was just treated as a family trouble call. And the odd thing about this is, even in the years where police were minimizing it, police officers were being killed by domestic violence offenders. Our first officer that we lost here in Nashville was 1875, Robert Frazier, killed by a DV offender. Every big city, small town has a case in their history where an officer is killed by a domestic violence offender. So we should have connected the dots then, because, officer safety is victim safety and vice versa. But I have to say that we're starting to understand the potential lethality, and a lot of us because of the research. A lot of cities now and states are doing fatality review, and they've been doing it for almost 25, 30 years now. Professor Neil Websdale in Northern Arizona, runs a National Institute on Fatality Review, and they look at domestic homicides, and they've told us what the precursors are to them. And when you look at the precursors to a homicide, you have to put officers in there as well, because the 3/4 of the victims are killed when they're trying to get out, and that's the same time officers are killed as well. So you have to really closely look at not just the incident. And this is another big problem that we faced in policing. Traditional police training has been incident-based by necessity. You follow the criminal code. You can't do that with these calls. These are crimes in progress. You have to always think about it that way. And where are you, the officer, interjected into that progress, and how dangerous that can be for you? You don't know unless you have some good intelligence, and some of that's through risk assessment, danger assessment, which we can talk about as well. But we've learned the hard way in policing, and so have victims. It is the most dangerous call. It's the most frequent call for service, but often it's the least trained topic in police academies, which is it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But we talk about that as we go along.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Mark, as you're talking about that. I mean, and you and I have had conversations about this, and how obviously this podcast even is being produced by the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, obviously we have the memorial wall, and there are 24,000 names, plus on the wall, and I know you and I have talked about how many of those are related to domestic violence cases, and I wonder if you could share a little bit about that and research you've done on that.
Well, I've got 4 friends on that wall. They're Paul Scurry, Lynn Hicks, Jerry Newsom, Billy Bolin. I worked with all of them. I was on the scene of all 4 of them when they were killed, right after they were killed. As a SWAT officer, I responded to Jerry Newsom's case. Deputy got shot, serving a protective order. So this is personal. It should be to us. I mean, if all the things you do in policing, domestic violence response should be the very best, considering the high price you pay at the hands of these offenders. And so so that means it should be the top priority. I mean, it should be the top priority, and who you select for your detectives, how you train your officers, how your sergeants supervise your officers on the scene, whether you do lethality assessments or not, how you trauma train your officers. So because of the price that you pay in policing, this should be, again, the highest priority for your law enforcement agency. But often it's not. And that's my, I spend a lot of time on the road, this. I've been on the road for years now. I think I've traveled almost 3 million miles since I started doing this work. And I'm still in conversations with police leaders about, you've got to stop and focus on this. What is your priority today? Now, I know the crimes are important, robbery, burglary, drugs, but where do these offenders come from? They come from homes filled with domestic violence. And stopping that exposure to children should be a big priority for police. Homes filled with violence, today are the wellspring for crimes tomorrow. So we have to look at it that way, and we have to stop doing the revolving door. We have to get down to, causation, and this is where all your violent offenders come from. And the other thing here lately we've been focusing on is mass killings. About a third or more of your mass killers, or it's about domestic violence. I know the Sutherland Springs, Texas shooting, largest church massacre in history. The core problem was that church was helping her get out of the relationship. Whitman, when I was a little boy, I was in school in Texas. I grew up in Texas, and I remember very well when Whitman climbed the top of the tower at UT and started killing people. Well, he killed his wife and his mother before he did that. So now we know. We know the precursors. We know the behaviors. And one last thing, I'll stop. Around 85, and I remember this very well, the Batters Intervention program started to spring up around the country. Now, Batters Intervention is court mandated group, not therapy, but it's accountability for offenders. Ellen Pence, Michael Paymar created it out of Duluth, and now it's all over the world. I've been in Batters Intervention programs in Brazil and Cyprus and Turkey, places like that. But what happens in those 23 to 52 weeks is a lot of these offenders finally confess. Not only confess, they tell us how they did it, why they did it, and how they manipulated the police. So it's not like we don't have information to focus our police efforts. We now know the research is kind of over. We know the offender, we know the victim. We have to know ourselves. That's the next phase.
That's a great point. Yeah, Bruce.
If I could, this is a conversation, right? And you started this by talking about how for too long, too many in law enforcement viewed domestic violence as a private matter. And just to illustrate, I think in my mind, I'm a simple guy. It helps to have situational scenario type parables, if you will. And my sons, I talk to them, obviously they're cops, they run DV calls. And Mark, I think credit goes to you. I think I might've heard you say or write this or something akin to this once before. And it's simply this: imagine two different couples. One is married or in an intimate partner relationship of some form. And he's on that power and control wheel, one of the worst offenders, just dominating and exercising complete dominion over a woman. And it will be a man over a woman. I'll specifically be gender specific here, because we know that's the lion's share of it. And he insists on having a hot dog cooked in a certain way when he comes home at a certain time, and woe unto her if he doesn't. And he comes home and she hasn't cooked it the appropriate way at the appropriate time, and he punches her in the mouth and she's bloodied. Now take that same guy, same demographics, age, height, weight, race, doesn't matter, except that they're not in an intimate partner relationship. It's a guy going to a 7-Eleven and asking for a hot dog. And that clerk at that 7-Eleven hands him a hot dog that doesn't meet the requirements as he stated them, and he punches her. I don't think any of us have any problem distinguishing why it is that is an outrageous crime and an attack that should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law when it's the 7-Eleven clerk getting hit, but not so much when it's the intimate partner. It's too easy, and we too quickly say, that's a private matter, that's their business. No, these are the same facts, the same woman, or obviously a different woman, getting punched for the same reason, but in very different contexts. And it's everything about those, that differential in the context that shapes the outcome and shapes the way even we perceive the crime when they're identical crimes. And I think that when we think of it that way, it helps narrow that focus as to why it's different.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
No, I was going to add to this. The thing about these kinds of calls is that they're not like other crimes where if you're focused on an armed robber, you look at that person's history. I mean, there may be drugs involved. It could be aggravated assaults. They live a life of crime, right? Until they're finally caught. With domestic and sexual violence, you see everybody involved. People, prominent people. I've arrested judges and ministers and police officers and federal agents, and so very often there's professions, and Bruce talked about this already about officer involved or officer perpetrated domestic violence. We get into these populations where people's kind of they give them the benefit of the doubt and they default to truth, and they want to say, "Now this is going to happen. He's a great guy. He's a chief. He's a sheriff. He's a judge." When in fact, you have to look past that and say, wait a minute, well, how much crime do you want your police to commit? And you have to deal with it appropriately and get over this. I just can't believe they did it. And the other thing too is people with power in government, especially criminal justice, have been pushing back on us for years. We still don't have uniformity across the country with policies and procedures on officer involved DV and sex assault. I mean, we're closer than we're further away, but we're not nearly where we should be. And that brings about a lot of other things like the community trusting you. If you can't trust the police their own, then why would I call you? So it's got a lot. So you see how the problem here is if I'm a victim and I'm trying to get out, leaving's a process, not an event. And if I wait longer, I'm in more danger. I wait longer because I don't trust you. If I don't trust you, I wait until the very last minute to call you, and then now that puts officers in higher danger. And then the last thing is how disrespectful it is for us to bury officers killed who died in the line of duty protecting victims of domestic violence, for us to now employ domestic violence offenders. I mean, it's a slap in the face of every family, of every officer who's been killed in the line of duty responding to these dangerous calls. So I've got maybe a different view on this than some, but I think I'm right on this topic. And I know Bruce and I have talked about this, and he's paid the ultimate price. And you don't want to be in that place as a father and mother. And Bruce is exactly right about the impact it has on you.
And you're exactly right. It's that feeling amongst mostly women again who will not call the police to help them out of this predicament because they not only suspect, they know their circumstances will be not improved, but worsened. Too many times, too many women have involved police, and it's gotten worse. And we could go into the mechanics and the reasons why, but my daughter I know is dead because a woman who had been abused by the very guy who ended up killing her had abused an earlier victim, not a shock. They don't do it once typically, right? These things repeat time after time with new victims. And that woman, who I'm in contact with, I mean, I know her, she very clearly says what we all know and has been said for decades now. They don't call police to help them, particularly when it's the police who are the perpetrator. Why would I call the police? The police did it. And frequently they've already been there a number of times, and things got worse, not better. And I don't know how chiefs and sheriffs sleep at night knowing there is a significant number of women and families within their jurisdictions who go to bed knowing if they get in trouble, they're not calling them. Who do they think is going to serve and protect them, if not the police? And the answer is it's a big crying gap and a chasm. And as far as I know, since Crystal Brame was shot and killed, yes, there's been progress. Yes, there has been policy and procedural development, more awareness. I talked to Julia and David Aarons, who were Crystal's sister and brother-in-law just, I think it was last week. In the 22-year interim between Crystal's death, and I assume everybody, well, perhaps some folks who might listen to this may not know who I'm talking about, but David Brain was the chief of police in Tacoma, known to be a brute and an abuser, and the agency didn't stop him, and he ended up killing his wife. She actually lingered a couple of days before she ultimately died, but he shot her in front of their 2 children, who her sister and brother-in-law raised. And, her dad went on to do a lot of good and promote a lot of awareness of OIDV, PPDV. And yet my daughter's dead. And yet I'm reaching out now to Lauren Samanchik. She's a 33-year-old veterinarian, was just killed in New Jersey in August, early August, along with her firefighter boyfriend, Tyler Webb, by a New Jersey state trooper, ex-boyfriend who stalked her. Nobody did anything to stop it. It had been reported. So again, change the names, change the dates, change the places, same patterns. As Mark said, this is a pattern. It's not an incident. It's a pattern of behavior that just plays out, spills out over time. And it's so consistent that for me, it's kind of aggravating that more hasn't been done. And particularly when as Mark mentioned, about policies and procedures that have developed, they do help, they can help. And there isn't that consistency across the nation. And why we don't use the best available practices, I don't get.
So let's talk a little bit about that and what has changed in the approach to domestic violence over the past few decades in policing. There have been some strides made to protect victims, to hold offenders accountable. There's still over the years that I've been out there teaching, you would hear a lot about, well, why doesn't she just leave, right? Why doesn't he just leave? We keep going back to the same house, all of those sorts of things. And you still hear that today as well. It can be, these types of calls can be very frustrating to respond to when you're an officer as well, because you're trying to help very often, and yet it seems like, it can seem like nothing is ever changing. So what sort of has changed, Mark, over the past few decades with how we train, policies, procedures, all of these sorts of things?
Well, quite a bit has changed, Josh. I mean, I remember my first training in academy in the late 70s. We were using the mediation model, which came out of New York in the mid 70s. And it was, trying to, it was conflict resolution. It didn't work. That was the first attempt, but the criminal codes didn't really catch up until the early 80s. So, and all this was pushed by the battered women's movement. The battered women's movement were women who ran shelter programs, who took the lessons from the civil rights movement, who said, we're not going to put up with this anymore. So they bypassed police and went straight to the legislature, got laws passed, and they really pushed hard. And then finally, along 85, came the Attorney General, who said the preferred response is arrest. So warrantless arrest laws were implemented in 85 around the country. The criminal code started to change finally. 87, 88, I think that's the first job I had with ICP. We actually trained chiefs how to write policies. There were no policies on domestic violence. And we got these arguments that say, well, you don't need a separate policy on this. It's just another assault. And it's not, as you know. The training started to improve, the hours up, but still we're not where I want us to be. Around 94, the Violence Against Women Act was enacted by Congress, started putting money into police training, hiring police officers, hiring advocates. The research started to shift around the impacts of arrest on offenders. We started to look at this as not just domestic violence, but co-occurring interconnected crimes with DV, sex assault, stalking, strangulation, child abuse. It's all connected. So this is the big one. I mean, if interpersonal violence is the big one. We started doing fatality review. Like I said, Neil Websdale started doing that. Lethality assessment came out of Johns Hopkins with Dr. Jackie Campbell in about the mid 90s. And now it morphed into police risk lethality assessments. We're not uniform there yet either. We're doing a pretty good job. I know Florida is working on that, or may have just implemented their laws around it. Family justice centers started to appear about 25 years ago, and those are all in one place, one stop for victims that are partnering with police. And we're asking communities, and we did this here in Nashville, to actually continually evaluate. I mean, you can't just do something and let it linger. You've got to continually evaluate, like the military. You know, people in the military tell you they audit and they audit and they audit. You have to do that with your community. So there's a standard community accountability and safety audit that your community can do through Praxis International out of Minneapolis. We did one here. It led to us building a family justice center. So you've got to continually assess your community and yourself. And by the way, IACP, if you go to the IACP's website, iacp.org, and just put in domestic violence, there's an incredible amount of resource there, including a gender-based violence self-assessment for agencies. We created it for agencies to evaluate how they're doing all these things, like, as Bruce said, police officer perpetrated domestic violence, sexual misconduct by police. So there's a lot of resources for you, but we've still got a lot of work to do. We're not there yet. We've got a new generation of cops coming online. I'm training I don't know what the letter designation generation is now. I think I'm training all of them. But they don't know. They just don't know this history. And we've got to make sure they understand how important it is every single call is to the safety of the victim and the officers.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Family Justice Center model, Mark, and in particular the one you have there, the system you have there in Nashville, because it's quite impressive. I was able to tour it the one time, but
took a long time to build it. No, President Bush Jr., when he was in office, had a long conversation, I believe, with Casey Gwynn, who was a former prosecutor at San Diego, and said, if you just put a little money aside and for seed money to build family justice centers, we can start down the road of having community accountability, basically what it is. And it's a collaboration. It's community coordinated response, what they call it, where everybody's in the same room together. There's no gaps in the system. And, we had about 12 in the first round. This is over 20 years ago now. We have 13 family justice centers in Tennessee now. So Casey, through the Alliance of Hope and Gail Streck, they have promoted this whole model worldwide. It works because you can't arrest yourself out of this problem. You got to have collaboration with the prosecutor, probation, child protective, and advocacy. And that's where the trust is built, all with a single focus of closing the gaps for the system when they get ready to leave and are prepared for them when they do that. Now, ours here in Nashville is the biggest in the country. And I'm really proud of that. I hope you all come to Nashville to see us. I'll show it to you. And miracle stuff happens there. I mean, it's just it's a wonderful thing. And it's to me, it's a nod to police. We're going to stop looking at you and telling you you're responsible for all this. And they're not. The community's responsible. You got to have a community that's willing to say, I'll partner with the sheriff. I'll partner with the DA. I'll partner with the church. That's what it takes. And when you start doing that, great things happen. I know my Family Justice Center here over a year ago launched a high risk assessment team model. Now that's the next phase in lethality assessment. My agency does the LAP, which is the lethality assessment program. Every patrol officer asks 11 basic questions about precursors to murder. If the danger is high for the victim, that victim is funneled into a high risk assessment team so we can avoid homicide. Again, that's not uniform around the country, but that's where we're headed. It's intelligence-led policing, but it's supported by the community and a family justice center. I hope that giving you kind of a clear picture there. I mean, anybody can do this. Rural communities, urban, suburban. They're building one in Chicago now. I was just up there last week, and it's going to be massive because Chicago PD, they run about 250,000 DV calls a year. And their DV homicide rates, just like everybody else, is pretty high.
And to your point, Mark, it can be done anywhere. I mean, there's some great ones in rural communities. Nampa, Idaho comes to mind, and the work that Angel has done out there. With
Waycross, Georgia.
Center. Yeah,
just down there. I mean, it's 16, 17 counties.
Yeah,
they got it worked out, and it's the cops love it because they can pick up the phone and call an expert and say, she needs to get out. I can't convince her. Can you help me? They do safety planning, risk assessments for victims. Again, up to the top of our conversation, you keep that victim safe, you're going to keep a cop safe.
Bruce, what do you think departments can do better to support officers who are themselves victims of intimate partner violence? We focused, some on what's happening, how changes have been made, domestic violence generally, but specifically when it comes to officers as victims and survivors. What do you think departments can do?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Diane Wettendorf, is the go-to. I would recommend everybody who graduates from an academy read Crossing the Threshold, one of her early books. She points out the almost impossible situation, in particular, a female law enforcement officer caught in the web of a domestic violence relationship finds herself in. She's damned if she does, she's damned if she doesn't. There's almost no way out. It is a terrible, terrible situation. And I think a lot of that points to culture, which we haven't even mentioned yet. It's obviously very easy for people to just slander the culture of law enforcement, the blue line, the code of silence, call it whatever you will. At bottom, there is something there. And I think there's this sort of conflation of the officer health and wellness, the mental health and wellness of law enforcement officers is one basket of incredibly important issues, but it's not the same as the murder, suicide, the PPDV, the OIDV thing. I don't think the guy who killed my daughter was necessarily mentally unwell. It was all about power and control and authority. Yes, we all know, or should know if we don't, and probably many civilians don't know, that officers in an average career experience something on the order of 700 to 800 PTSD-inducing traumatic events, singular, independent, discrete events, any one or two of which would slay me, would put me in a hospital, would render me incapable of getting out of bed. You guys, to your everlasting, credit, or not, because some of the agency support isn't there, and they say, okay, that happened, get your butt out there on the line. We got calls to run with no gap. And you guys know this far better than I. But I think there's a tendency when these OID, and I know the question was, what can you do to prevent law enforcement officers caught in the grips? But I'm segueing. But the conflation of officer mental health and wellness, I mean, almost immediately when these things happen, the Samanchik case I referenced, Abby's case, the chief, the sheriff says, oh my God, what a shock. Who could have seen this coming? How did this happen? And they then every next utterance, every 8 or 9 out of the 10 things they say and or the press say will go to officer health and wellness, mental health and wellness, not perhaps screening for the aggressive profile, that psychological profile way too many officers carry into the job at inception. We know there are people who are just given to or have proclivities to exercise, an abundance of power and authority and aggression. And policing, obviously, you're training them to use those tools. You're enhancing those tools. You're giving them access to databases and equipment, technologies and approaches that, as I think, Mark, you've called them super predators or something to that effect. So if you don't, I think the short answer to your question is don't let them in the door. Don't let people who are likely to abuse don't give them those tools, those extra powers. Avoid the problem entirely. And then the female law enforcement officers are far less likely to be preyed upon by them. A female officer, is, I don't mean to be rude or anything, but is almost fresh meat to some of these agencies. And the guys, the predators among them, view the new young female recruit, just getting off FTO or whatever, what team is she playing on and what can we do about it? And, there's some really crass, base, subhuman behavior going on that needs to be wiped out at all levels. I think the older I get, the more I understand that the most innocent of so-called locker room chatter, men degrading, demeaning women, objectifying women, that sort of thing, it magnifies over time, and it creates a culture that permits these seeds of aggressive, I think, and destructive power to start to grow. So that stuff has to be stamped out, and that's a culture thing. And I don't care how many policies you write, how many procedures you write, the culture will eat that policy every single time. If the boss doesn't own it, if the command staff isn't living it, breathing it, and demonstrating that these aren't just hollow words on paper, folks. These things matter. And there's a Sheriff Gregory Toney and I think it's Broward, somewhere in one of the South Florida agencies. They just had a terrible case some months ago. First thing that man said was, "We missed the boat, folks." And it wasn't a cop on civilian. This was, or a cop on cop. This was just two civilians, but they missed the boat on a DV thing, and a bunch of people got killed, including a neighbor who completely innocent, and he owned it. And now I think it might be up to 11 people have been fired. He's putting meat on the bones, and I don't hear anybody holding him up as an example and saying, this is what has to happen. You need to be held accountable. So if you want to protect people, you have to build a culture that's held accountable, that doesn't permit even what seems to be innocent little chips in the armor or cracks at people, and make women. I mean, the 30 by 30 initiative, I hope that, I don't think that'll happen. I hope it does, but having more women, particularly as Mark says, whatever the generation we're up to, XYZ, awesome, because they may be less tolerant of the kind of nonsense that older guys like me and others have perhaps abided and accepted.
Well, and to highlight a couple of things that you said, Bruce, one 30 by 30 initiative, for those who may not be familiar with it, is an initiative that was created to increase the number of women in law enforcement to 30% by the year 2030. Currently, the numbers sit down around 14%. So still a long way to go, but they have ticked up over the years since 30 by 30 has gotten started. Something else you said, Bruce, about culture, it always reminds me of a quote by Lieutenant General David Morrison from Australia, where he says, "The standard you walk past is the standard you accept," is his exact quote.
What you tolerate, you promote.
Exactly.
Said differently.
Yeah, I think it's always been a very impactful quote to me, where it really does go to the culture you're talking about. And there are programs out there that do address culture now in ways that we haven't seen in the past, like EPIC that came out of New Orleans, and now with the ABLE program run out of Georgetown Law, where it looks to empower bystanders and make them active bystanders in intervention strategies, not just around domestic violence, of course, but just culture in general, and protecting officers, protecting officers from doing maybe something that they shouldn't be doing, whatever that might be, as small as it is or as large as it might be. But there are programs out there that are really great in addressing some of those challenges that you speak of. Mark, I don't know if you have anything on this you want to add.
No, I agree. Bruce sounds like a police chief. I'll hire you. By the way, the police chief who you'd want to have, by the way. I'm not picking on the chiefs here, but we spent in the Leadership Institute at ICP. Well, I think we trained around 1,000 chiefs nationwide, and this topic was the number one topic. It was OIDV, came up over and over again. Every agency's got their history of this, and not only that, but sexual misconduct, which I'll mention in a minute. But post commissions are telling me, and have been telling me for a pretty good while now, the number one crime that causes decommissioning of officers is domestic violence now. It used to be DWI, and number two is sexual assault or sexual misconduct. And ICP's got they've got a policy on officer involved, but it's not the only one. But they've also got a pretty good policy on sexual misconduct. And that's another, I'm talking about not sexual harassment now, I'm talking about sexual misconduct. And that's part and parcel of part of the problem. And you got to take a look at your agency around this issue. If you don't, you find yourself in hot water again, not only with sexual misconduct against the public, but against your own officers. Bruce talked about this with female officers. They face a tough job of working in a male-dominated profession. And just give you an example, Tom Tremblay, former chief up in Burlington, Vermont, and state police commander, he and I did the patterns of practice investigation for the Civil Rights Division in Chicago. And it was pretty amazing. We reviewed over 500 cases of officer-involved domestic sexual violence. And to their credit, they reconfigured their investigations tactics. And they just recently agreed to implement a sexual misconduct policy for their officers. And my agency in Nashville did the same thing. So it's an ongoing, evaluation of modern standards. Like you said, you don't want to walk past this kind of behavior and then put it in place. And I think, I'm hopeful, as I said earlier, I'm hopeful that now you bring it out in the light of day and it's, you can see what it is. And that's, that sunshine's a disinfectant. And this is why it's important to do things like we're doing now with this podcast, to talk about it, to normalize this conversation and at the roll call, with one officer over another, a cup of coffee, and hiring practices, how you hire, how you do your backgrounds, early warning systems inside your agency, how your sergeants are trained, how effective your investigations are. Does the law keep its promise to everybody, including police families? So we're on the right road, but we're it's kind of like this. I heard a police chief, Lou Ritter, is a deputy out in LAPD years ago, say, gentle pressure relentlessly applied will get you the change you're looking for. And that's what, and in the 47 years I've been doing this work, that's been sort of the formula. It's just gentle pressure. We're not there yet, but we can't let up. We got to keep pushing and applying pressure to everybody so they'll see it the way we do it.
Can I add something, Josh?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Mark, you mentioned that one of the primary drivers of decertifications, as DV calls it, or SA, from officers under in uniform under the color law. That implicates something that I think Ruth Raimundo Mandel calls the data desert in OIDV, PPTV, and that is to say that we don't have good data. We do know that in the civilian context, generally speaking, DV itself is underreported for a multiplicity of reasons. I think that is a fact. I'm not going to put numbers on it, but we know it occurs more than it's reported officially. In the law enforcement context, which is to say when the perpetrator is a cop, it's less reported. I think that too we could accept as true, regardless of what the numbers are. And the relative prevalence of DV amongst the law enforcement community itself is an unknown. And estimates vary widely, and very scant research has been done about it. And I don't think it's an insane proposition to say that if you want good policy, you need good data. And there are many out there who will say that the reason for decades now, Mark, if you've been at it for 47 years, I'm assuming that in 47 years, you can't point to a singular, authoritative, dispositive summary of the incidents, the prevalence, the outcomes of DV perpetrated by law enforcement officers, or even in the civilian context. We don't know. And we don't know because nobody's been authorized to study it. And I don't know the answer, but I know that it's a gap that is creating a situation that allows this to perpetuate. And at some point, somebody's got to bite the bullet and say, whoa, wait a minute, let's figure out what's happening, who, what, when, where, how, and why, and then we can do something about it. I'm happy to hear you say, Mark, that many chiefs talk about and acknowledge when they're, in their gatherings with our IACP or otherwise, that OIDV is even an issue. I have some friends who are former chiefs who've gone to some of these conventions who've informally polled chiefs, what are you doing about OIDV? And they're like, oh, what is that new band? Is that a sandwich? What is that? They profess no knowledge.
Well, I'll tell you, Bruce, what I'm encouraged by this, states now are enacting statutes that require agencies to have policies on OIDV. I just did a training with Vermont. They just implemented their policy,
Yep.
Washington, Oregon, which means now we're going to start to see data because there's going to be more arrests, more decertifications. So now we have these statewide test beds where we can see some of the numbers. The post commissions that they hold a lot of data that we need to start looking at, because they are actually decertifying officers, but we don't know those numbers yet. But you're right, there's no central, place yet where the federal government can say we're going to look at this carefully and see where we need to go in the future. But I'm optimistic about this, that we're going to eventually see some changes, because you got to have the data. I mean, it's got to happen. And you're right about the reporting. We don't, there's always been estimates, half report just in the general population. And then you have to look at if the general population, we think about 10 to 15% are suffering because of domestic violence, and we pick officers from the general population, then we at least have a 10 to 15% chance of getting someone in ranks who's an offender, which means we have to examine what that psychological looks like, how we train up polygraph examiners. This is about breaking down the culture of what Tony Boza, who was the chief of Minneapolis years ago, said, that blue wall, that's code of silence.
Yeah.
You break it down by, again, just using careful data that tells us, yeah, this is a problem. Anecdotally, you're right though, Bruce. They tell us, well, I don't know if I got that problem or not. But you look around the room, you get a bunch of chiefs together and they go, man, are you crazy? How'd that happen? You must be very lucky. You must be living right if you don't have one of these kind of cases.
Well, I'm not going to be, I get the gentle pressure relentlessly applied. When you're in my shoes, it's different, because when I talk to, Crystal Brame's sister, we're like, are you kidding? 23 years later. And I'm hopefully going to be talking to Lauren Samanchik's dad soon. So I got yesterday's, I got decades ago, and I'm like, why are the same things happening, folks?
Well, too, one last thing about Tacoma, I've trained their officers there before and after Brame killed Crystal, because they've got a family justice center named after her now in Tacoma.
Oh,
yeah. It's lawsuits are a big motivator for police. We don't usually win these lawsuits in policing when an officer involved case comes up. I think they settled for $15 million in Tacoma. Silver City, New Mexico just settled for $15 million. Courts don't let people hide behind qualified immunity around domestic violence cases, because state laws mandate you have to do more for victims. But there's incredible amount of liability here. So if you're managing your police department, how much your budget you want to give away. And I know that's not the most important thing, but if I'm responsible for that money, that means I can't hire officers. I can't buy police cars because I've got officers who are abusing their family, and I got sued over it because I didn't do anything about it. So it's an old saying in liability, and I teach it for IACP. Smart people learn from their mistakes, but intelligent people learn from other people's mistakes. And there's a whole catalog of cases where police ignored the victim and were sued because they did that because the victim died. So it's a warning to the wise here around management policing.
So great conversation so far. And I think a lot of this, I'm hearing themes about like officer safety and wellness even as well. And not just when it comes to officer involved, officer perpetrated as far as the offender, but also as victims as well. And whether they're law enforcement or not, there's an officer safety and wellness component to this. this problem. It's traumatic. It's traumatic to the victim. It's traumatic to the officers. It's, and we've touched on all those things. And I want to give an opportunity to expand on the conversation around officer and safety and wellness a little bit. We are going to come back and revisit this more broadly in another podcast episode. But I wanted to give you both the opportunity to address that as well, if you have any comments around officer safety and wellness in particular.
Yeah, I do. I remember because I SWAT officer 15 years, and you see a lot of interesting things. In my department, we responded each year to about 50 of these calls. I've run about 600 tactical calls over the years, and the trauma accumulates. Bruce talked about this. We used to deal with it by, pulling over the parking lot somewhere late at night, and our doctor would arrive, Dr. Jack Daniels, and that's how we dealt with it. Until finally we got police science that said we got to take care of the emotional state of officers, because officers kill themselves more than suspects do. So we had to deal with that. But here's something it helps me when I train police today. If you're trauma informed, we know that the physiological impacts of trauma on the person's body. We know the neurological impacts, where you have fragmented memory, you have all kinds of unbelievable impacts of trauma. We studied in policing. That has helped us understand trauma with domestic violence victims, with rape victims, with stalking victims. So now, when I talk to police about this, I start off by saying, tell me about your first time you were traumatized in a police shooting. And when you were interviewed, because I used to work police shootings, homicide detective, and I'd interview officers and they couldn't remember half of what happened. And we automatically think, hell, you're lying. You pulled your gun, you fired it. Don't you know how many times you shot? And in fact, they didn't. And for years, we put dishonesty in the investigative file. And finally, the Canadians figured it out, and they told us, don't do this. Send them home. Put their feet up. Get an adult beverage. Take a break. Your memory will come back into some form. Now we're asking officers to, and that's what happens, right? That's the standard now. But the question is, what happens when you don't do that with a rape victim or a domestic violence victim, and they don't give you the answers you think you deserve, and you judge them and you put, false reporting or unfounded, and you move on. In fact, you've just walked past a felony in progress because you didn't understand trauma. So trauma's got to be at the top of the list of training for the future for dispatchers and investigators and police and all the civilian employees you have. Because you can see it in two places. You can see it inside the building where you work as a sheriff, and you can see it with the victims you deal with every day. I mean, one thing that stood out for me and the federal investigations, and I was involved in some of this, of the untested rape kits, was the unbelievable misunderstanding of the trauma in the statements in the field report of an officer. I mean, Detroit had 14,000 kits they didn't test, and we looked at the reports there, and there was a complete misunderstanding of trauma. So this is if all the things I've seen in the last couple of years that have been major, this is a major moment for us in policing to understand that impact of trauma, not just because wellness, that's important, but because of us judging people. There's a really good book I've just got through reading. It's Talking with Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And Gladwell talks about this a little bit. Because if we don't understand it, we might walk right past things like the Sandusky case or the Nassar case, or cases like that are mass numbers of victims, and we miss it. So trauma's got to be at the top of the list around our future and understanding interpersonal violence.
Yeah, absolutely. The more I've been around the country talking to officers about trauma, it's always fascinating to me having those conversations, because they can be difficult conversations to have, right? Where, they can be counterintuitive to how somebody thinks somebody might be reacting to something, and to have those conversations, and the ability to have those conversations in advance rather than out on the street when you're responding to the call. I think it just goes to the types of training that we need more of, whether it's particular to domestic violence or not. I mean, they're good for any types of crime victims. You could be a victim of a robbery, and what is the victim focused on? They might be focused on the barrel of the gun, and they didn't see anything else that happened. And so I think being trauma informed is a real key to unlocking a lot of different types of crimes.
No, and by the way, for supervision, I can tell you as a patrol sergeant, I used to have to go with my officers and they would see things, didn't understand it. Because I grew up in a violent home, so I had that, that historical trauma that I could share with them about why these people do what they do. And then as a detective supervisor, I used to have to keep an eye on my detectives. I had 20 detectives who worked for me. And we worked about 24,000 cases a year of domestic sexual violence and homicide. And if you don't understand trauma, you're not thoroughly investigating. You see something and you write it off as, oh, well, this is just somebody just lying, making it up. And especially with rape and false reporting rapes 2 to 8%. It's not 50, 60, 70%. So our misunderstanding of trauma led to a lot of injustice, and injustice led to murder. I'm just going to state it like it is. Mm-hmm. These are course of conduct crimes, as we said, and they don't stop. This is not a cycle of violence. We've all used that for years, but that's not used anymore. These crimes are on a continuum, and nothing changes until we change it. And that's accountability and arrest and prosecution.
So if I can, a short parable on culture again. I won't name the agency, but I saw a sheriff interviewed by a local television station, and the fundamental point of the interview was to talk about the officer health and wellness programs that they had made available to their deputies. This is a $500 million agency, fairly well budgeted, one of the bigger ones. And after a long talk about breaking down the stigma of deputies being able to go avail themselves of the mental health and wellness programs without stigma attaching, without jeopardizing promotion, shifts, assignments, the interviewer just paused for a second and had an epiphany and said, "Hey, by the way, Sheriff, you yourself see trauma. You yourself go on calls. You've had a long career. Do you use the service? Do you avail yourself of it?" And it was his opportunity to hit it out of the park. And he said, no, I don't use it myself. I don't need to. I have friends outside of law enforcement. I have a terrific wife and family. And I was like, oh my God, dude, you just missed the boat. If you're some deputy in crisis who happen to see this interview and you're about to make that call, are you going to make that call now? No. It's the culture. You got to put meat on the bones.
Absolutely. And it can be difficult, right? It's, when you enter this profession, very often, you think you're expected to be a certain way, right? You're expected to just let things roll off. And it's not until you get pushed sometimes that you realize that it's okay to let things impact you. It's part of being human, even to let things impact you. I remember the first violent accident, car crash that I was on, and one person was almost decapitated, and an officer from another agency pulled me aside afterwards and asked if I was okay. And it was that simple, sort of acknowledgement that it's okay to feel something about this. It's part of being a human. And it's the same with responding to calls around domestic violence, right? It's okay to feel things. You have a job to do, certainly, and you have to respond a certain way, but it's okay to feel badly for people too.
Josh, the first time I went through critical incident debrief was after a SWAT call we'd been on where Fender was killed, and the chief ordered us this team into assessment with the psychologist, and we were all mad as hell at the chief. We wanted to storm the chief's office. How dare he? We're the toughest of the toughest, and we all sitting there in the doctor's office. There's about a dozen of us, and we didn't say anything for about 20, 30 minutes. People were mad, and she just sat there and waited for us to start talking. Finally, one of the older heads said, "Well, yeah, I guess we need to talk about this." And finally, he said, it's just like that event we had 3 years ago. And somebody said, well, we had two about 4 years ago. And somebody said, well, y'all remember about, back in 88 and 87. And after a while, what rolled out in that room was about 25 years of unbelievable trauma. We're grabbing a tissue box, crying, blowing our nose, crying. And we finished the session, all walked out in the hallway, and we just stood there for a few minutes, looked at each other, and thought, what in the hell's the matter with us? And then we all started hugging each other. I guess people thought, who are these men in the hallway hugging each other? but it was one of those moments where for that first time, we flushed out trauma and we all felt better about it. I mean, it's nothing about being manly or, you can't handle your own emotions. It's toxic, and you let it sit there. And I can tell you from supervising people who work emotional labor cases like child rape, I used to have to keep a real close eye on my detectives because you can ruin a man or a woman in policing if you don't keep a close watch on them working these horrible cases. That's got to be dealt with. So we need to stop, you know, uh, trying to pretend we're, Superman and pick up, you know, Gil Martin's book on emotional survival for police and read it a couple of times, which is used as a primer. And I've been promoting it for years, and it's spot on. I Love a Cop is another one. I mean, we need to examine ourselves so we can last long. You don't want to burn somebody out in 10 years when you have a 30, 40-year career. And so you got to look at the trauma and deal with it.
Shifting gears a little bit, what kind of training, policies, procedures, advocacy, what do you both sort of think, um, if you do nothing else in an agency, if you can implement nothing else, what are the types of programs that you should implement in your agency, not just around officer involved domestic and perpetrated domestic violence, but just generally around domestic violence? And I know we've touched on some of them, but just to nail down, what are the key ones that you really need to be focused on? Mark, I'll start with you, and then Bruce.
Well, this is a big topic. I'd say we still got a real problem with reporting. I think rape, the numbers are up to about maybe 20% now, but we've still got a lot of work to do on sex crime. Ending Violence Against Women International, which was started by Joanna Shambo years ago out of San Diego. It's a worldwide nonprofit. They've got about 140 hours online training course that you can take. You go to the website at EVAW International and get yourself, ready for the sex crimes investigation, even for patrol officer. That's one. I think we have to stop making excuses about risk, lethality, and danger assessment. The Canadian Police Chiefs Association has said years ago, you can't police these cases without a risk assessment because gives you an idea of the potential of the offender. You have to take a close look at high risk assessment teams. The Geiger Institute up in Massachusetts, they're promoting high risk assessment teams. They're a great resource for you. If you want to look at your city, I'd go to your Google machine and just type in Blueprint for Safety. That's a St. Paul study. They took a 2-year study of their city and changed it completely in Ramsey County. It's great city, great county. We have to evaluate our training. I mean, I think the last study I looked at was average state, county, and police academies only have about 16 hours of training on domestic violence, where you'll do a half or third of your career on domestic violence calls as a police officer. It's not proportionate. We need to be careful about this. Make sure we at least give our officers what they need before they hit the street. I'd like to see 40 hours on DV, 40 hours on sex assault, and then the last one I'd say is stalking. It's the next phase of a violent relationship. The Stalking Resource Center is a great resource if you want to go to their site. We worked on a policy. We just finished it year before last. That we have a national model policy on police response to stalking, because you got to have this is a real complicated crime, especially today with technology. And if you don't understand stalking, then you're not going to lower your DV homicide rate, because 80% of our DV homicide cases, there was stalking before the murder. This is not rocket science. Hell, you know who the victim is, you know who the suspect is. What are you doing about it? I think this is a sort of the problem with the Broward case, and it has been for other cases as well. So there is a model DV law enforcement policy, and I'll send you the link if you want to send it out to folks. But it's through the Stalking Resource Center, SPARC, SPARC. So that's a few things that we can do. But we gotta start looking at what is victim centered and what's trauma informed, and we talked about this already. And then what does collaboration look like in my community? I mean, we can't keep fighting with Child Protective Service and and probation, we got to be in the same room together. If we don't, again, it's dangerous for the officers, it's dangerous for the victims, and your community's not safe. We got a chance here. We know the formula. We just got to put it in place, and the leadership is the last thing. I'd say we talked about this already, but it's if you're a strong leader, you have to look at your communications, how you talk inside the agency and outside the agency. You have to look at your standards. What are my standards? Are they the highest they can be? And ICP sets that standard, and a lot of other people do too. They're not the only ones. And then you have to check your accountability. Who am I accountable to? Am I accountable to the public, which you are? Am I accountable to my officers, which you are? Am I accountable to myself, which you are? And you have to make sure you instill accountability throughout the ranks, because your legacy, when you leave, and you will, like I did, when you leave, you want that legacy to be strong, with a high priority on preventing domestic and sexual violence in your community.
Thanks, Mark. Bruce?
Yeah, I come at it, obviously, not having been a law enforcement officer, but having my kids, and then, of course, Abby's death. That's the experience that frames my response. And my response is that I have become aware of Russ and Myra Strand's FETI training, much like some of the other programs you name, Mark, but I know that forensics, experiential trauma, interview technique. I know one of my sons took it, changed the way he views it. He does not show up on a DV call, never did, when he was doing patrol work, the same after that training. It opens your eyes, it opens your mind, and you don't see that call as that discrete one-off, why doesn't she, this is the 8th time we're here this week, why doesn't she leave? All that hostility, that frustration. I get that. And you have to understand, it's 18,000 or so agents. I know you guys do, but the listeners may or may not. 18,000 or so separate law enforcement agencies in the nation, small, medium, large. They don't all have the same budgets, the same resources. So in answer to your question, it's like, what can you reasonably expect law enforcement to do? In a perfect world, by all means, you do all the full panoply of programs and resources Mark named. But if you had to winnow it down, from my outside experience, I would say, Jesus, just please, folks, can we get the guys and the women who respond to these calls, that first line, leading edge of the sword folks, to understand this isn't just a, did he do it? Did she do it? Primary aggressor, who's hurt? Was there a crime? Who can I lock up? I got to get to my next call. They got to get out of that mind frame and view this thing as, like you said, Mark, an ongoing pattern of behavior. I've now entered into this. Where are we? And slow it down, look at it, and do that analysis that says somebody's really in danger here. Because again, going back to my starting point, I look at it from what I know from my sons and my daughter and what happened to Abby. And when I look at the 4 corners of the incident report that was generated after I've mentioned an underlying DV offense that her killer was involved with years earlier. When I look at that, you mentioned stalking, Mark. I see stalking. He called this woman 17 times in the span of very few minutes. I think it's technically statutorily stalking. There are a number of other things he did there and then nobody picked up on. Nobody paid attention to, or they didn't ignore them. I don't know. That's not the point, really. It's just that the clues are there when you know what to look for. And if it is predictable, it's preventable. And I think when we're informed, whether it's by FETI standards or all the other things you named, cops have a better chance of interrupting that flow, whether it's a civilian or an OIDV context, doesn't matter. They know what those red flags are. They know what the signals are. And they have a possibility of saving a life. And if they don't have that training, they're not going to know. They're just going to say, why doesn't she leave? The hell with it. I'm out of here.
Josh, the frustration, which has been studied, we studied it, about domestic violence calls in police and inattention, leads to tombstone mentality. I've seen it. I've answered calls of officers who pulled the front door, not the end of the street. And then, like it's no big deal. And I used to have to dress them down about their own safety. but you have to examine how that happens, and that's got to be your focus in your training. So you explain to officers why you cannot lose focus. If you unplug tactically on first response, you're asking for trouble. And if part of that unplugging is you're just mad at somebody because they don't, run up and give you a big wet kiss when you walk in the front door, well then you're missing what's really happening here. There's a positive and negative for victims of responsive police. I grew up with an offender who fought the police, and I was afraid of the police as a child, and I lived with a criminal. So put yourself in that spot. You got to explain to police that, and we've had hostages tell us after hostage situations, I didn't report. I ran back in the house when you were telling me to run out of the house, and they would tell us, you know what, I didn't want to run out when I could have, because I've learned how to survive without you. I didn't know how to survive with you. So we have to examine that victim's experience. If we do, then it makes it easier for officers to understand, wait a minute, this is not a minor call, as Bruce said. And then you start focusing on the context, and you got to have a mindset of building the contextual picture of a crime that's dynamic. It's been going on for years.
And something you said too, Bruce, I just want to highlight there, agencies sometimes, I think, in my experience, as well, I'm sure as both of yours, fall back on the financial piece, right? We can't afford it, all those sorts of things. And there are programs out there that can help. The Collaborative Reform Initiative, Technical Assistance Center, CRITAC, run through the COPS office, the Department of Justice COPS office. Mark, I know you've done training through CRITAC, and it's no cost training and technical assistance for agencies. They just have to request it. Domestic violence has historically been one of those topics. There's the OVW, Office on Violence Against Women, Law Enforcement, National Law Enforcement Training and Technical Assistance Center on Violence Against Women. OVW LETAC provides no cost training and technical assistance on a wide variety of topics related to domestic violence, stalking, sexual assault. So, there are resources out there, and I think that's important to highlight. I'm glad you said that, Bruce, because it's important to highlight that, it's not an excuse anymore, because the money is there if you're looking for it.
Josh, I'd like to see, if I had a wish list, I'd like to see you and the museum and the memorial do a deep dive into 25,000 officers. I think we've lost since beginning the country, and take a close look at an analysis and analyze, by the way, the offender, if you can, the officers, and give us some data out here in the field to share with the departments, and then maybe shape the way the national leadership groups like ICP, Noble, and the NSA, and PERF, and all the others, how they train. We got to get this at the top of the list for people to understand that these crimes they're predictable and they're preventable. That means that we can maybe save an officer's life or two. And then at that point, you no longer become a museum. You become a real force in the safety of officers on the street today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, you mentioned before, when it comes to even mass attacks, active assailants, if you factor in domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, it's well over 50% of mass attackers that have a history of some kind of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking in their background, right? It wasn't even that they were carrying out an incident or carried out an incident in the past. It's or right before the mass attack. It's that they had that in their history. It's one of the risk factors. And the Secret Service has even done work on identifying that as a risk factor. So it's and when you do start to dive into of the names on the memorial wall, how many officers died at the hands of an offender of some kind, whether they were offending at the time of the incident where the officer was killed or not. It's got to be a huge number of names on that wall. And if we can prevent even one more, line of duty death through looking at this type of research. I think that's extremely valuable. That would be extremely valuable.
You know, Gerald Feineman, I know you know Gerald, he was a prosecutor at Riverside for years. He did some studies on officers killed in the line of duty in Riverside and found half those officers killed in the line of duty were killed by half the offenders, by the way. Half the officers killed were killed by offenders who had strangled their intimate partner in a domestic violence case. So you start to see these connective tissues with these kind of cases. And then access to firearms. I know in Sutherland Springs, Bill Grayson, who's lieutenant of San Antonio, he was a member of the church, told me this guy who killed these people at this church should have been prohibited from owning a gun. He was convicted in the Air Force for DV, and he got out, and the Air Force didn't tell Texas law enforcement. He bought that rifle and went in and killed 23, 24 people, wounded 22 others. And they sued the Air Force. I think they got a $235 million settlement out of it. But if one thing had happened, all that others would not have happened. And that's, again, everybody understanding there's no margin of error here. You cannot underestimate these offenders because it looks like it's nothing. And all of a sudden you've got a mass killer. And there's the trend when you look at Pleasant, Texas, 5 shot, 3 killed. Odessa, Texas, 3 killed. Pittsburgh, 3 killed. Birmingham, 3 killed. You just lost 3 in Pennsylvania. They're killing multiple officers now because the weaponry's gotten more and more deadly. That police departments have to buy these damn Bearcats just to answer a DV call, and because these weapons are out on the street, and that's what these offenders want. This is what they want to put their hands on because they want to inflict as much damage as they can to the police when they arrive. Because the police, and this is real critical, are taking control away from a controlling personality. And this is the way they get that control back, by overwhelming the police. They know what police tactics are. And so they're ready for us.
Well, I want to give a chance as we get close to the end here to have you both provide some closing reflections. Bruce, I'll start with you. What message would you like to share with officers, policymakers, families who may be facing similar situations to what happened with Abby?
Yeah, I'll keep it simple. I think that a far more fulsome and nuanced appreciation for the parameters, the dynamics of domestic violence, understanding domestic violence in all its permutations will save lives. And when we know from all the people, programs and resources we discussed, when we know that those things are available, there is a better way. I'm from the construction side, real estate side. I don't want to have to develop a new technique, a new program, a policy if it already exists. If I have a problem and the answer exists, why not use it? And I'm bumping into the notion that the only barrier is culture. The primary barrier is culture, regardless of which side of the equation the cultural pressure is coming from. And it's frankly coming from all sides. But when we know there's a more intelligent way to predict what's preventable, and we don't use it, like you said, or my formulation is, you promote what you tolerate. With your Australian guys, same formulation, same point. If you don't choose to use the best tools, the best knowledge, the best approach, you're complicit, arguably. So pick up that knowledge, pick up those techniques, do the learning. Like you said, some of them are even free. I wouldn't want to have to explain to the next Bruce Bieber why you didn't do it to save his daughter. And it's that simple.
Thank you, Bruce. Mark, we've talked a lot about, what we still need to work on and, what hasn't gone well over the years. And I think that's an important conversation to have. It's not to implicate anybody. It's not to, chastise anybody. Sometimes we did the best we could with what we had at the time. And I think that's an important point, but it is important to learn from our history. In the museum here, I'm reminded of that every day, right? That we need to constantly learn from our history. We need to learn the good things that happened. We also need to learn some of the bad things that happened, and learn from those as well. So what gives you hope for the future, Mark? You've been doing this a long time. What gives you hope for the future?
Well, people like you, people like Bruce, the museum. I mean, these are all things that didn't exist when I first started my work. Um, the fact that I'm talking to young officers today, Josh, who don't have the luggage that my generation had around bias, prejudice, homophobia, and the culture is shifting. They don't, when I talk about discrimination and bias, they look at me and say, "That's your generation, not mine." So I'm hopeful that this young generation, who are much smarter than me, much more well educated, much more in tune with the community, is going to make a big difference in the future. Plus, I think we still got some work to do as men around how we feel about women. Most of these crimes are committed against women. I mean, there are male victims. I don't want to exclude them. But you look at most often women are the victims, and we have to examine ourselves as men and say, when are we all going to sit down together and start talking about, and you don't have to have a gun or badge to do this, about how the society feels about women. How do you feel about them in your workplace? How do you feel about your own family? What do we tolerate as men? Because if women could stop domestic violence, we wouldn't be having this podcast right now. So it's going to take us as men, and especially in policing, to make the police environment even much more friendly. And that if we do that, then here's what's going to happen. It's not going to be 30 by 30. We'll see 50 by 50. And I think that's the equation, because you have to look at your population. They look at us, so we have to look like them. So I'm encouraged. I know as I train overseas, often I hear, like the Brits now, they criminalize coercive control, thanks to Evan Stark out of Rutgers, and it's coming here. We need to get ready for it. How are we going to train officers to understand what coercive control is? We get to the coercive control, we may never see the assaults or the homicides. So I'm encouraged. I think we've come a long way. Got a long way to go, but and I encourage you officers listening to this. I know a lot of you like specialize in traffic and drug enforcement. The cat and mouse, sexy crimes, robbery. Think about spending your career preventing murder. So you'll never have to sit down with a man like Bruce Bieber and explain what happened to his daughter. I mean, that's saving a life is job one. You can do it with your brain. You can do it with your training. You can do it with your desire if you want to. I've worked in homicide for years. It's too late for homicide. If you can prevent that murder, that's modern day policing.
So I really want to thank everyone for joining us for this important conversation on the lethal realities of domestic violence and the impact on law enforcement. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to you, Mark, and to you, Bruce, for sharing your expertise and personal stories. Your voices are helping to drive change, save lives, and that can't be understated. Domestic violence is not just a private issue. It's a public safety crisis that affects officers, families, entire communities. As you've heard today, progress has been made, but there's still much work to do in training, policy, and support systems. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please seek help. There are resources available across the country, and you're not alone. National resources also exist on domestic violence. You can find more information at websites from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the Office on Violence Against Women. To learn more about this topic and future episodes in our series, visit the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund website, www.nleomf.org. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and thank you for your service.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.